birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good. So today's in large part about the arc of the relationship with my mother and I. And those that know the story, some of them see it as a tragedy. Well, I see it and hold it as a love story. But why do I do this? Why do I feel compelled to stand here and share my stories? Well, at first I thought it was because it's in my DNA. My dad, natural, talented performer. My mother, creative, charismatic in her unique way. So naturally, one of their children would find a way to a stage. And then I thought it was because of the experience I had after my very first show. It was the morning after I was driving my car, beautiful spring morning, had my sunroof open, crystal clear blue skies. I could feel the warmth of the sun kissing my skin. And I was leaving a message for my mom. Mom, I did a show. And then I was talking with my dad, I did a show. And I go like this because he died when I was 14 years old. It was 1976. And back then, no one was talking about death and dying, and certainly not what happens after death. But I still felt like I could feel him and hear him. So I just kept the conversation going. Dad, I did a show, and I heard, do you want to do this? Yeah, I want to bring the juice from last night's show to a show tonight. Do you want to do this? Yes. And from below the seat in my car, this energy started moving up my body and was rocking my body in the car. And I was sobbing like I'd never sobbed before. And when that energy hit my heart just exploded open. And now I've got to cross over 3 lanes of traffic. And I thought that was it. And then most recently I was in an authentic relating conversation. And this young woman looked at me and said, Ashleigh, I see you're getting excited about starting to share your new monologues, but why is it so important? And have you ever had someone that just asked you a simple laser-like question? You see, my heart hardened at a really young age, and I built up very thick, very tall walls to protect my heart, so I'd never get hurt again. And these experiences that I share have helped melt the walls. And that night, as I was falling off to sleep and my head was just about to hit the pillow, my little girl sprang up inside and said, tell him it's because of me. Tell him it's because of me. And I realized I've had a subtext under every story that I share. And that's my little girl inside talking to your little girl or little boy, saying, this has been incredibly healing for me. Maybe it could do something for you. That's why I share my stories. Can I tell you about a woman? She was born Ida Renee Schwartz in 1929, the oldest of 4 children to Russian immigrants. Now, this is not her story. This is my story about her. She was raised as a princess. Her books and her music sheets were her best friends. She was a talented pianist, avid learner, and always loved a good conversation. And her parents had this motto that life was to be a party, so have fun. So she grew up in homes with delicious food and music and laughter. In 1950, she married my father. And back in those days, a woman had 2 choices: become a wife and mother, or a spinster. And I believe she chose the path that looked easier. And they had 4 children. Stephen was the oldest, Cheryl, Jody, and then me. And relatives through the years have always told me how they respect and admired her because she had her own unique sense of leadership and style with her clothes and makeup and jewelry. And she created beautiful homes, had a loving husband, and seamlessly raising 4 children. And then menopause hit. And a whole new surge of creativity came online. And she was writing poetry and sculpting and painting. And the way she tells her story, my father was not supportive of her creativity and didn't contribute anything additional to the weekly allowance. So, after 21 years of marriage, she asked for a divorce. Stephen and Cheryl were 19 and 17, and they could choose, and they chose to stay with our dad. Jody and I were 12 and 10, and were given custody to my mom. Now, my mom was not wired to be a single mother, and I believe the stress of that, changing hormones, and we got robbed. And they took all her artwork and all her jewelry. And I believe it was those factors that contributed to her having a breakdown. So Jody and I went and lived with our dad, and my mother went and lived with her parents in Florida. And she trusted her parents. And her parents trusted the doctors. And in 1973, they gave her shock treatment. And back then they weren't sophisticated with it, and they blasted her. And she fractured into what we called her 6 channels. There was sweet, gentle little girl, mean and nasty, depressed one, where she'd wave at me like this when I stood in her bedroom doorway to come over for a visit. Out there, where she understood what she was talking about, but nobody else did. Entitled queen, and lucid phenomenal. The woman I looked up to in awe as a little girl and often thought, that's my mother. And I believe the intelligence of her psyche fractured in this way so that she wouldn't be irrevocably shattered. When I was born, the doctors told my mother I wouldn't walk because my legs came out like this. But I believe it was my mother's tenacity because she massaged my legs every single day. And when I was in 1st grade, I was given the role as Mama Bear in our play. But there was a problem. I wasn't learning my lines. And the teacher told my mother, look, if she doesn't have her lines memorized by Monday, I'm giving her role to someone else. Well, my mother practiced with me all weekend. She stood at the top of the stairs in our house and had me stand at the front door. And I not only had to recite my lines to her, I had to project my lines to her. Well, Monday afternoon, the teacher was so impressed, she asked my mom to be the backstage mom. So there we are, the night of the performance. I'm on stage with Baby Bear and Papa Bear. My mom's backstage. I'm feeling proud. We get halfway through the play, and then there's this long, awkward silence. Well, Baby Bear wasn't remembering its next line. Well, I knew the whole show, so I leaned in. Hey, you're supposed to be saying, who's been eating my porridge? And the whole audience broke out in this roaring laughter. And a seed got planted. But I didn't always feel a connection with my mother. I have memories of holidays where Jody and I would get these bags of fake jewelry and toys and candy, and she'd invite Jody to sit on her lap, and they'd go through her bag, and I'd wait patiently for my invitation and not get one. And other memories of family barbecues in our backyard, and she'd ask me to step aside and then ask my dad to take a picture of her, Jody, and Cheryl. And then when I was 9 years old, my best friend, who was also our neighbor, came into the back door, into the kitchen where my mom and I were standing. And my mother just did not like that this little girl walked in like that and scolded her. And she ran home crying. And then her mother came in through the back door. And they had this intense verbal exchange. And her mother left through the back door. And I stood there looking at my mother like, what did you just do? And she did not like me looking at her in this way. And we didn't have a verbal exchange, but we certainly had an energetic one. And I remember all these new feelings running through my body, which I didn't understand, like what I was feeling. And I didn't feel like I could talk to my mom. She didn't feel safe, and there was no one else around. So I ran out our front door, and I'm standing in the yard. And these energies, these feelings are just pouring through me. And somehow I organized that energy and I focused it on that little girl. And I became a bully. And I bullied that little girl for over a year. In my 20s, I was living with a couple of girlfriends in an apartment and I got the flu. Now, after my mom had her shock treatment, she stopped driving a vehicle, but got around town in a 3-wheel bike with a basket in front. But I lived too far for her to ride her bike, so she got into a taxi with a watermelon and rubbing alcohol. She came over, she rubbed my body down, she fed me the watermelon, she stood at the foot of my bed and sang to me. And I remember my girlfriends standing in the bedroom doorway looking in with these expressions on their faces like, oh, my mother would never do that for me. And I was feeling a lot better, and my mom left, and my girlfriends came to me and said, could we adopt your mom? Could your mom be our mom? Really? You see, because my mom and I, we just had this hot and cold dynamic. When it was the two of us, I felt our bond. I felt our bond with the earth and fashion and French food. But it often got overshadowed when my sisters were around. And I often felt like the fourth wheel to their perfect trifecta. So we just missed our love and care for decades. And then when I was 42 years old, I took a Byron Katie workshop. And it's this simple inquiry process where you bring your stories and your beliefs and you test them out. And I started with my mother's story because I carried that one probably the longest. Like, we just don't have this certain type of connection. And the process goes like this. Do you know the story to be true? Oh yeah, I got decades of validation on it. Can you absolutely know that the story is true? Absolutely? No. Who would you be without the story? Well, more open, free, or more loving? Can you give one reason to keep the story that doesn't cause stress? No. So I chose to drop the story. And when I dropped the story, that, my mother and I, we just don't have this connection. Could I see that, when I was making that assessment through the decades, I was 6, 12, 15, even 25. And I know I felt what I felt, but maybe I fully didn't understand everything that was going on. And when I could see that, could I name for the first time the longing I've had most of my life for my mother to see me and love me in a particular way. And that just might not ever happen. And when I could name that, could I fully feel all the feelings that went along with that? And it was a couple of months after I took that workshop, and my mom came out here for a visit. And we were standing in my kitchen about 2 feet from each other. And she looked at me, and my mother's got this very deep, penetrating gaze. And she looked at me and said, I love you. And I was able to respond with, I love you. And I went to bed that night feeling full and whole. And thought, Mom's in her late 70s. She could pass away soon. And I felt complete in the relationship with my mother. I had no idea we had a whole other chapter waiting. So because of the experience I had after that very first show, I just kept taking myself to a different edge. And I was working on my current show where I rented a larger venue. We were selling tickets. The venue was advertising it, so I didn't know who was going to be in my audience. And it was the day before the show. I was getting ready to practice one last time, and Jody called. Hey, Joe. What? Cheryl's in the hospital. Cancer. Pancreatic. Stage 4. What? Where did this come? It was going to be her kidney. How's her one kidney? 30% of her one kidney's functioning? And immediately, 1/3 of my brain goes to South Florida, where my mother's lived a mile from Cheryl for 30 years. And now she's facing having to say goodbye to her first daughter. And Jody's lived a mile away for 30 years. They've weathered relationships, raising children, and hurricanes together. And Stephen lives 45 minutes away. They grew up together. They always spoke of this idyllic childhood. And even when they didn't speak for 3 years, you could still see the bond between them. Oh, this is going to be big. And a second third of my brain was in my relationship with Cheryl. She was 7 years old when I was born. I was a living doll. My mother told me once I could walk, she could never get near me because Cheryl was dressing me, feeding me, entertaining me. And when our mother had her breakdown, it was Cheryl who was making sure I got to school on time. And when our dad died, Cheryl was 21, and she stepped up and became my legal guardian. Now I'm having to say goodbye to her, probably very quickly, and much, much sooner than I thought. And this last third of my brain was in this moment in my life with me, where this natural momentum was happening. And I went from one reality of thoughts and emotions to another. And after about 30 minutes, I decided, okay, let's see if I can bring this all together and still practice to see if I've got any juice for this show tomorrow night. Well, I found out I had plenty of emotional juice that I performed to a sold-out audience. And what I netted from that show was $400, which was the exact airfare that got me to Florida for the first of many trips. Now, the trips to Florida were all-inclusive, all-pervasive, because something I didn't know about cancer but learned very, very quickly is everybody around that person is also dealing with so many emotional layers. So I made sure I got down to the beach and would float in the ocean, sometimes for hours. And then when I would come back to Colorado, I'd rest. I'd rest to recover for the next trip, but also to be resourced for the inevitable. When Cheryl passed, I wanted to be strong for my mom. And on this one trip resting here, I started feeling creative, and I took that as a good sign. So I started leaning out of bed, and the hand of God came down and said, rest for what's to come. And I thought, okay, what's to come? Cheryl's going to pass. I want to be strong for Mom. Rest for what's to come. So I listened, and I rested for what was to come. It was getting near the 1-year mark from Cheryl's diagnosis. Chemo wasn't working, hospice stepped in, and we were tracking her vitals. Cheryl's son Matthew lived and worked in New York, and he and I would alternate being in Florida. But on this one night, we were both there by her side, telling her, thank you for everything you've done for our family. We love you. It's okay to leave. We're going to be okay. And I really wish my mom could have been there. But I also understand she had a big fear of dying. But all of a sudden, she walked in with her walker. And I saw Stephen had been behind her, but he chose to stay in the living room. But I know he had to have said something to her to give her the courage to be there. So Cheryl had her son, her mother, and myself at her side. And the last thing I said to her was, surrender love. That's all you got to do now. Surrender to love. And she took 2 more breaths, and she did. Jody idolized Cheryl most of her life. And what we fully didn't recognize was the depth of stress Jody had been experiencing. There was Cheryl's impending death. She was a single mom now to a teenage son for 6 years. She was a home health nurse in South Florida. And she was not only a nurse in her career, she ended up being a nurse in her marriage. Because 10 out of her 12-year marriage, her husband was getting recurring brain tumors and actually went blind the second year, and menopause. Jody was generous to a fault. She always put her husband's and son's needs before her own. When she'd come and visit with Cheryl and I, she'd lie down, and within a minute she was sleeping. And at the time we joked about it. But I understand now that is complete exhaustion. And she witnessed firsthand Cheryl's fear of dying. And I believe it was all those factors that contributed to her making a decision. And she chose to end her life 3 days before Cheryl. She was done. She knew I'd be here for her son, our mother, and at Cheryl's side. God received her, and she was there to receive Cheryl. My brother Stephen is alive. Saw a recent Facebook photo. But he felt incredibly responsible for Jody's death. We were standing in Jody's kitchen and he said, "Tell Mom Jody's death's on me." And at the time there was so much going on and I knew I'd have an opportunity to sit down and talk to him to say, no one's holding you responsible for Jody's choice. But I've not had that opportunity because he chose not to come to the double funeral and has chosen not to speak to us since. So, in the span of a week, I lost all my siblings, and my mother lost 3 out of 4 children. And I'd wake each morning, cry a little, sit at the edge of my bed, and ask my heart and soul, like, how do I say goodbye to her now? This goodbye is very different. And I saw her condo turn into her casket, but I wasn't coming up with any solutions. So we were looking at assisted living places, and we were setting up the delivery system for the grocery and the drugstore, but none of it felt right. And we were interviewing elder caregivers, and one of them whispered in my ear, "The best thing is to stay together right now, to help facilitate your healing." Oh. Could I? Would I? "Mom, pack a bag. You'll come with me. We'll figure this out a season at a time." Because I had to get back to my support system, and she was happy to return to Colorado. She loved the difference between Colorado and Florida. So she packed 2 bags, she grabbed her music sheets, and we boarded the plane with her walker, her wheelchair, and our 2 broken hearts. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for us, and I'm curious. She thrived here. She dropped 50 pounds, she got off 4 prescription medications. She shut her TV off that had been in 24/7 for decades. And she started playing the piano again. And I often said to her, Mom, let me take you to the Jewish Center. We have so many resources here." "Oh, Ashleigh, what am I going to do with a bunch of old Jews?" So my friends became her friends. And I set her up with my hairstylist, my esthetician, and my massage therapist. Because like mother, like daughter, a woman needs their services. And we created rituals together. Whenever we'd go out together, I'd first put in James Brown's song, "I feel good, like I knew I would," and we'd dance. And this one morning, I remember I was really getting into it, and I was down here, and after a little while, I was like, "Oh, let me check on Mom." And she was over there dancing with her walker, but holding on to the bottom rung down here like this. I'm like, no, you don't have to dance like me. Do your own thing. "Well, why not? You're doing that." And when I would go out without her, I would go to her and say, "Mom, I'll be home around this time. And it was as if she could care less what time I was coming home. What was most important to her, and was all of her life, was what was I wearing? So she'd always give me the once over. If she liked what I was wearing, thank you. If she didn't, could I have another top, please? And I thought, this is an easy way to make Mom happy. I was hoping she'd survive at least a year, right? To enjoy the Boulder lifestyle and also to emotionally metabolize what happened so that she wouldn't have to take that with her. But after about the 10th time of her asking me to change my top, I'm a 54-year-old woman now. What does that matter? You're my representative. Every time you leave the house, I want you to be one of the best dressed women in the room. Well, I couldn't argue with that. So I changed my top a lot. And early on, she had this curious request. She asked me to get her the 5 CD set to the music of the 70s. And I thought, now that's interesting. That was my music. I was a teenager then. But I got her the CD set and the music's playing in the house and I'm singing and reminiscing and feeling it's doing its music therapy magic on my heart and cells. And that's when it dawned on me. 1973 is when she had her shock treatment. So she was reclaiming what was temporarily fractured. And some of my most precious moments were at night where I'd help her with her pajamas. And she could do it for herself. It just would take her longer. And I especially liked the 2-piece set with the buttons on the top. And every time I buttoned up those buttons, I would reflect on, she did this for me, and now I'm doing this for her. And then we had the other moments. Because one day, I just looked at her and said, "Wow, you could be so selfish. Well, you could be bossy." And we went into this intense silence. And after a few hours, I went to her and said, "Mom, since the girls have passed, I'm just hyper vigilant over your health and well-being. After I wake up, I come to see if you're breathing." Oh, don't be ridiculous. I'm like, no. Women younger than you without this kind of shock and trauma have just passed away in their sleep. I'm not being melodramatic. And for a minute, I could see her take in my reality. And then there was this other dynamic that was happening, and it took me a minute to figure out what it was. But when I did, I named it, "Who's the Mother Now?" Dance. And it was about the 4th time our egos were just banging into each other, and again we went into that intense silence. And in that silence, we reconciled. I reconciled the fact no set of circumstances is changing the fact that she is my mother. And she reconciled, yeah, there's more on my plate now, more for me to think through and plan and navigate. And with both those dynamics, I watched our communication take a quantum shift to more love and kindness. And then there was the retraining. Because if she saw me walking near the kitchen, 2 jellos and a guacamole, those were her snacks. And I remember this one morning, I was particularly feeling a lot of stress, and I went to her and said, "I'm going to need you to put that in the form of a request." A request? Yeah, a request. You see, because when you throw that demand out, it just hits me really hard. I don't want to walk around like this. I've worked really hard on my anger. God knows I had a lot to be angry about. But if you can't figure out a request, we'll figure out some other accommodations. And she looked at me and said, "The way you've chosen to live your life, to help you get through your gray clouds, incredible. I'll figure out this request. Thank you." And I held it together, turned around, walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and cried a little. So we were on this extraordinary journey of reclaiming our mother-daughter relationship. We were elder and caretaker, and two women healing our hearts. And she'd often reminisce about the girls and say, like, they're with us, can't you feel them, can't you feel them? I'm like, yes. If Jody's contagious giggle in my ear and Cheryl's sweet love comes across my heart like a chiffon scarf, yes, yes, I feel them, I feel them. And one morning, we were standing in the kitchen, she looked at me, she goes, I'm mad at them. I was supposed to go first. And I hate being a burden to you. Your life has stopped because you have to take care of me. And I want to die. I'm ready. Mom, I don't carry it as a burden. Yeah, sometimes it gets stressful, but also I'm enjoying having you here in my life in Colorado. I don't carry it as a burden. Talk to God. Well, she never brought it up again. So we were creating a new life together, metabolizing death and facing it together. And I would not be the same woman standing here before you today if it were not for the love and laughter of friends, the hot springs, and a very special salted caramel edible chewy. You see, I was actually going to the dispensary for my mom. She was open to it, and it was helping with her physical pain and her disposition. And then on this one trip there, they said, Ashleigh, it was just your birthday. You get a free chewy. I'm like, great! So I brought it home, and it sat on my desk for 3 weeks. And one Sunday night, I ate it. And after about 45 minutes, I still didn't feel anything. And I thought, oh, okay. I guess with these chewies, it's just this very slow, mild, easy experience. Well, the very next second, I was hysterically laughing because of a blank piece of paper on my desk. Oh, shit. I better get really high. I better go check on Mom now. So I pull it together, walk into her bedroom, take one look at her face, start laughing all over again. And she's like, what's happening? What's happening? I had some marijuana. Do you need anything? Oh, no. Oh, well, that doesn't happen for me. And I thought, okay, great. Mom's settled, and that's a good idea. I'm going to get in my bed. And the next second, I was. And there I am looking up at the ceiling. And that's when I got in touch with my breathing. It went like this. This is my inhale. Really slow, really long inhale. Really long. And then at the top of it, there was this pause. They talk about it in meditation. Pause. And then the exhale. Just as long, just as slow. And that's when I thought, well, I wonder how many servings that was. I presumed it was one. If I wake up tomorrow, I'll go check. 10 servings. It was 100 milligrams of CBD and 100 milligrams of THC. I was high for 5 days. But the gift of that chewy showed me a new baseline for my nervous system. And I started noticing this interesting rhythm with my mother and I. Like after an experience like that, or when I had come home from the hot springs, I could see and feel her keenly observing me, because I was naturaler, easier, kinder. And then I would notice she would have a shift. And then I'd have another shift. And then she would have another shift. So I was witnessing our nervous systems co-regulating. And 1 year rolled into 2. And in the second year, Jody's son Josh, who was 21 now, came and moved in with us. And 2 years rolled into 3. And in that 3rd year, I was still totally devoted to her having her last breath with me in our home. And I could no longer deny the tired that was in my bones. Because I didn't want to lift the walker or the wheelchair or schlep the groceries. And my mind only wanted to think about my needs. But I was still totally devoted to her because I needed something. Because at this point it felt like it was larger than mother and daughter reclaiming their relationship, and larger than the fact that this woman's had a lot of shock and trauma. So I needed something. So I went out to our front yard where we had these tall evergreen trees. And I asked the trees, why am I so devoted to this woman? And I heard, it's your part in healing the feminine. And the truth of that statement shot through me like a lightning bolt. And yeah, I could see, we're all born into this fragmented feminine. So yes, I could do my part. And it was also the perfect elixir for me because of the commitment I made to myself to treat her with kindness, compassion, respect, and patience. No matter what she was throwing at me, I wanted to reply with kindness, compassion, respect, and patience. So this was the perfect elixir. So I was in. And the next morning I woke up and could feel like there was something visceral in my system that wanted to get out. And I knew exactly what I needed to do. So I opened up my computer and I started writing. And the words were just flowing out of me. And this wasn't the kind of writing where I would think about what to say. Because I knew no one's ever going to see this. And I knew I didn't want to carry whatever this was. So for 2 hours, I was like Mozart on my keyboard. And when I stopped to look back and read what I had written, I named for the first time how difficult it's been most of my life to have my mother as my mother. And I named for the very first time the layers of shame I carried that I was in denial of. And I named how hurtful it felt when she would wave at me like this when I would come over for a visit. And I could feel like I was setting myself free of these dynamics. And not only within me, but between us. And it was a couple of weeks after I wrote that letter that I was at the hot springs. I was the only one in the pools, early morning sun rising. And I received what I can only say was this claircognizant download. I was shown and told, my mother, she chose her journey. It was her part in healing the feminine. And I went from carrying the story that she was weak and a victim of circumstances to seeing her as this incredibly powerful, resilient, loving woman. And I went from judgment and shame to immense respect, awe, and gratitude. And as I stood in those pools in the early morning, all the memories from all the different events and things that had happened through the decades were just flowing, rushing in. And for the first time in my life, I had absolute gratitude for all of it. And it was a couple of months after that, I was standing near my mother's side, and I looked at her and said, you should have never have had children. And she looked at me at first like, who are you that you can see me? And her brain must have told her, this is your daughter. But she could see I had no resentment or anger. I was simply naming what I saw, who this woman to be, thriving as her own independent, autonomous woman. And we stood there, two women, in the presence of this truth. It was the most enlightening moment I had with my mother. And in that 4th year, I noticed a pattern change with my mom. Mean and nasty, out there and depressed channels just weren't around anymore. An entitled queen transformed into magnanimous queen. And lucid phenomenal had most of the airtime. The last 3 weeks, 3 days of my mother's life, she was the most aligned, clear, and coherent that I ever experienced her. She had so much joy and love running through her body that from her bed she would make up songs and sing with, sometimes with words, sometimes just with sounds. And we'd start each day with, "I love you." And she'd wait to make sure I received it all the way in. And then, "2 jellos and a guacamole, please. Thank you." Because we were aware and awake to the preciousness of each moment. And one day I was standing near her side and she looked at me and she goes, Ashleigh, this is so exciting because now I'm here watching you launch your business and I'm able to give it my blessing. And then after I'm gone, I'll still be able to watch. I'm like, oh, yeah, because I'll still need your creative input. Oh, definitely. And Ashleigh, after I'm gone, I'm going to be so happy and you're going to be so happy. And no tears, no grieving. Mom, I think there'll be a little bit of grieving. No. Just do it now. I just want you to get on with your life. And then one night, right before my eyes, she lost all her sentences. She sat at the edge of her bed with her eyes wide open. But all she could get out was yes and no. And the hospice nurse came over and affirmed she had a mini stroke. And I thought, oh, for the love of God, after everything we've been through, now we have to deal with a stroke? And I sat there and I had my moment. Yeah. And we'll face this together too. And within a couple of hours, she was back. And she had all her sentences back. And so we had a music therapist come over who played her violin and her ukulele, and a death doula came over who just retired from a 30-year career, but heard about my mom and wanted to meet her. And after a very lively conversation they had in her bedroom, she comes out and she goes, "Your mother's incredible. Can I come back for another visit?" And a good friend of ours who was a nurse practitioner for 30 years came over, and after her visit she comes out and she goes, "It's remarkable the way your mom's recovered. Incredible, remarkable." Yeah, that's my mom. And then one night, as she was falling off to sleep, she said, "I miss Jody and Cheryl." She never said that in 4 years. But when she said, "I miss Jody and Cheryl," I knew. I knew it was time, and I knew she was ready. And she died peacefully and quietly with me at her side, the way we wanted. The last 3 weeks, 3 days of my mother's life were the best 3 weeks and 3 days of my life with her. And we had a celebration, a life ceremony for her. This woman was not getting a funeral, and no one was to wear black. So we told people, wear your best and brightest colors. And we had Jewish prayers and Hindu prayers and oming, and we sang her name, Ida Renee, Ida Renee, Ida Renee. And an opera singer came in and sang us an aria. And we invited people to stand up and share a moment of reflection they had with my mother. And I learned more about my mom that day. I am the legacy of this extraordinary woman I've had the honor to call mother. I've been her daughter, her caretaker, and her midwife. And I am proud to be her representative. This year marks the 9-year anniversary of my sister's passing. And I always leave those 3 days open. And I'm always singing, dancing laughing with Jody, and in a cocoon of love with Cheryl. And on the third day, I was like, oh, Mom. And she goes, darling, I'm here. I'm at your back. I've got your back. And your sisters, they're on either side of you. And I've experienced this. What I fully didn't recognize was the day I went out to those trees and asked, why am I so devoted to this woman? And I heard, it's your part in healing the feminine. That was just the beginning. Because this experience continues to inform me, because it's affected everything about me. The elixir I was giving my mother to treat her with kindness, compassion, respect, and patience was actually also an internal elixir for me, because I'm that with myself in depths and degrees that I never have been before. And since that I'm that with myself, I am easily that with others. And the layers of shame have transformed into vulnerability. And that has changed everything. And I'm more aligned, clear, and coherent with who I am and my gifts and how I want to share them with the world. And just as my mother carried me in her womb, I carried her in mine. And I came upon my mother's journals. And there was this one entry that had my attention. She wrote it in 1976. And it simply stated, I must heal the relationship with my daughters. I must heal the relationship with my daughters. Well, Mom, we've done that. And then some. So thank you for watching the Mother Monologues, A Love Story. I hope you feel inspired. And if you're feeling like you want to start shifting the dynamics, yes, with your mom, but really in any relationship, I have some suggestions for you. The first one, write her a letter. Write her a letter that no one will see. Say it all in the letter. 2, find out who your mother is. Who was she as a little girl, as a young woman? What were her aspirations? And 3, take her off the hook for the woulda, coulda, shouldas. You're an adult now. One of the most powerful, empowering things you can do for yourself is take full charge of your healing. Because you don't need to do the healing with her. She doesn't even have to be a part of it at all. And I promise you, it'll be one of the most powerful, enlightening experiences you have. And then watch the dynamics between the two of you change. And if I may, a couple of requests. Look down below in the notes. There'll be other links. One, to donate to the channel if you feel so inspired. There'll be other monologues that I will continue to be dropping on this channel, so subscribe. And most importantly, love one another. Thank you.